There are wars won by courage. There are wars won by industry. And then there are wars lost by decisions. In this video, we're going deep into 20 fascinating and devastating strategic mistakes made by Germany during World War II. Not myths, not propaganda, but real decisions taken by real commanders that changed the course of history. From overconfidence and blitzkrieg tactics to catastrophic miscalculations in Russia. From ignored intelligence warnings to ego-driven interference at the highest level of command. If you are passionate about military history, strategy, and the turning points that shaped the modern world, this is where the story truly unfolds. Because the fall of Nazi Germany was not just the result of Allied strength, it was also the consequence of its own fatal errors. The first mistake happened before the war even officially began. It's great to have you here. If you enjoy these war journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. This helps others find their way here too. For now, let's begin our journey. Adolf Hitler had built his military doctrine around speed, shock, and psychological dominance. The concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, had proven terrifyingly effective in Poland in 1939 and later in Western Europe. France fell in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped at Dunkirk. Europe watched in disbelief as the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. But early success can be the most dangerous illusion. One of the most underestimated strategic miscalculations was Germany's failure to fully prepare for a prolonged industrial war. Unlike Britain and later the United States, Germany did not initially convert its entire economy to total war production. Hitler believed campaigns would be short, victories would be decisive, enemies would collapse quickly. This assumption shaped everything. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering declarations of war from Britain and France, the German High Command still believed the conflict would remain limited and contained. They expected political fracture among the Allies. They did not anticipate a global industrial coalition forming against them. The second major strategic error emerged during the Battle of Britain in 1940. After the fall of France, Germany stood at the edge of total domination in Western Europe. The only major power still resisting was Britain. To invade, Germany needed air superiority over the English Channel. The Luftwaffe launched sustained attacks on British airfields and radar installations. At first, the strategy was militarily sound. The RAF was under immense pressure. But then came a decision that would shift the course of the air war. In retaliation for British bombing raids on Berlin, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its focus from RAF infrastructure to bombing London and other civilian centers. The campaign became known as the Blitz. The shift gave the RAF breathing room. British radar systems remained operational. Airfields recovered strength. Fighter command rebuilt strength. Germany had been close to crippling Britain's defensive air capability and then abandoned the effort prematurely. It was a turning point. Historians still debate whether Germany could have truly forced Britain to surrender, but what is undeniable is this. The strategic pivot from military targets to civilian bombing relieved pressure at the exact moment the RAF was near exhaustion. Emotion overrode military logic. The third mistake grew from ideology. Hitler consistently underestimated his enemies. He saw Britain as decadent. He saw the United States as weak and racially inferior. But his most catastrophic miscalculation was his view of the Soviet Union. In June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest land invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the border. The initial advances were staggering. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Millions of prisoners were taken. German commanders believed the Soviet state would collapse within months. They were wrong.
One of the central strategic errors of Barbarossa was the failure to define a clear primary objective. Instead of concentrating all forces toward Moscow, the political and logistical heart of the Soviet Union, Hitler repeatedly diverted armored units south toward Ukraine and north toward Leningrad. The result was fragmentation of momentum. The delay proved fatal. By the time German forces approached Moscow in late 1941, winter had arrived. Supplies were stretched thin, troops lacked proper winter clothing, vehicles froze, weapons malfunctioned. Soviet reserves, many transferred from Siberia after intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack in the east, counterattacked with fresh strength. The myth of invincibility shattered outside Moscow. This was not simply a battlefield setback, it was a strategic collapse of assumptions. Germany had planned for a short campaign. Instead, it found itself in a vast war of attrition against an enemy with deeper manpower reserves and increasing industrial relocation beyond the Ural Mountains. Another grave mistake was logistical arrogance. German supply lines during Barbarossa stretched hundreds of miles over primitive roads. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. Nearly 600,000 horses were used during the invasion. Fuel shortages became constant. Ammunition deliveries lagged behind advancing units. The German High Command had planned based on speed, not sustainability. When the Red Army did not collapse, the German machine began to grind. Then came the declaration that stunned even some within Germany's own leadership. In December 1941, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States. It was not required under the Tripartite Pact. Germany was not obligated to declare war unless Japan had been attacked first. Instead, Hitler chose escalation. This decision transformed a European war into a truly global industrial confrontation. The United States possessed unmatched manufacturing potential. Within years, American factories would outproduce Germany in aircraft, tanks, trucks, and ships at staggering levels. What had been a difficult war became mathematically unwinnable. Germany now faced Britain in the west, the Soviet Union in the east, and the United States across the Atlantic, 3 industrial giants. At the same time, strategic overreach became systemic. Another critical error lay in Germany's alliance management. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, repeatedly launched poorly planned offensives in North Africa and Greece. German forces were forced to intervene to stabilize collapsing fronts. The Balkan campaign in 1941, necessary to rescue Italian failures, delayed Operation Barbarossa by several crucial weeks. Those weeks may have cost Germany the chance to take Moscow before winter. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel achieved tactical brilliance but suffered chronic supply shortages. The Mediterranean supply route was vulnerable to British naval power. Instead of consolidating resources on decisive fronts, Germany spread its military strength thin across multiple theaters. Then there was the ideological war in the East. Rather than presenting themselves as liberators from Stalin's brutal regime, the Nazis imposed policies of terror, racial extermination, and mass repression in occupied Soviet territories. Millions who initially despised Soviet rule were alienated by German brutality. Potential collaborators became partisans. Resistance movements expanded behind German lines. The war became not just military, but existential. And Germany had turned millions into enemies. By 1942, the strategic landscape was shifting. The failure to defeat the Soviet Union quickly forced Germany into a two-front war it had historically sought to avoid since the days of World War I. Hitler himself had cited the dangers of such a scenario, yet he walked directly into it. As the conflict intensified, Hitler increasingly centralized military decision-making. Professional generals were overruled, tactical withdrawals were forbidden, entire armies were ordered to hold positions at all costs, even when encircled. This pattern would culminate in one of the most catastrophic decisions of the war, Stalingrad. But that is where the next chapter begins. because the mistakes that followed were not simply errors of planning, they were decisions driven by pride, obsession, and denial, and they would consume entire armies. By the summer of 1942, Germany stood at a crossroads. Operation Barbarossa had failed to deliver the quick collapse Hitler had promised. Moscow remained unconquered. The Red Army, though battered, was rebuilding. German casualties were mounting. The war in the East was no longer a campaign of maneuver, it was becoming a war of attrition. Yet, instead of consolidating, Hitler doubled down. The next strategic gamble would lead the Wehrmacht toward the Volga River into a city that bore the name of his greatest enemy, Stalingrad. The objective seemed logical on paper: capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, cut Soviet access to vital fuel supplies, and sever transportation routes along the Volga. Oil was the bloodline of mechanized warfare. Germany's own reserves were limited. Romanian oil fields could not sustain a prolonged global conflict. But the plan, Case Blue, was fatally overcomplicated. Instead of concentrating forces toward one decisive objective, Hitler split Army Group South into two massive formations, one driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the other toward Stalingrad. This division diluted strength at exact the moment concentration was needed most. German generals warned of the risk. Hitler ignored them.
As the Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus advanced towards Stalingrad, what had begun as a strategic operation turned into something personal. The city was not just industrial, it carried symbolic weight. To capture Stalin's city would be a psychological triumph. Symbolism began to outweigh strategy. By September 1942, brutal urban warfare consumed the city. Every factory, every apartment block, every stairwell became contested ground. Soviet forces under General Vasily Chuikov adopted close-quarters tactics to neutralize German air and artillery superiority. The fighting became so intimate it earned a name: Rattenkrieg, Rat War. The Luftwaffe reduced much of the city to rubble, but the ruins favored defenders. Meanwhile, a far greater danger was forming beyond the city itself. German flanks along the Don River were thinly defended by Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units, poorly equipped compared to the Red Army formations rebuilding in secret. Soviet intelligence had identified the weakness. In November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. Instead of attacking the heavily engaged German troops inside Stalingrad, Soviet forces smashed through the weaker Axis flanks north and south of the city. Within days, they encircled the entire German Sixth Army. Over 250,000 Axis troops were trapped. German commanders on the ground urgently requested permission to break out while escape was still possible. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein proposed a coordinated relief effort. The window was narrow, but it existed. Hitler refused. He ordered Paulus to hold Stalingrad at all costs. He believed the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air. Hermann Göring assured him it was possible. It was not. The Sixth Army required approximately 700 tons of supplies per day. The Luftwaffe, under ideal conditions, could deliver a fraction of that, and winter conditions made flights increasingly deadly. Soviet anti-aircraft fire intensified. Transport aircraft were shot down in alarming numbers. Inside the pocket, starvation began. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Ammunition ran low. Horses were slaughtered for food. The wounded froze in makeshift shelters. Still, the order remained: no retreat. This was not merely stubbornness, it was strategic paralysis driven by ideology. Hitler believed willpower could compensate for logistics. He viewed withdrawal as weakness. He had been vindicated before, at Moscow in 1941, where holding defensive lines had prevented collapse. But Stalingrad was different. By January 1943, Soviet forces had tightened the noose. German positions were split in two.
Paulus requested permission to surrender. Instead, Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal, a rank no German officer had ever surrendered with before. The implication was clear: die, but do not surrender. On February 2, 1943, the remaining German forces capitulated. Approximately 91,000 soldiers were taken prisoner. Only a fraction would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe. Germany lost an entire field army, vast quantities of equipment, and the aura of invincibility that had defined its early victories. From that point forward, the Wehrmacht would fight defensively in the east. Yet even after Stalingrad, strategic errors continued. Another critical miscalculation came in the summer of 1943, the Battle of Kursk. Following the Soviet winter offensives, a massive salient formed around the city of Kursk. Hitler saw an opportunity to regain the initiative by launching a pincer attack to encircle and destroy Soviet forces. The operation was named Citadel. But there was a problem. German intelligence underestimated Soviet preparation. Thanks in part to intelligence networks and decrypted communications, the Soviets knew the attack was coming. Instead of withdrawing, they constructed one of the most heavily fortified defensive systems in military history. Layered minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery zones, and deep reserves. German generals urged for an earlier attack before Soviet defenses strengthened further. Hitler delayed repeatedly, waiting for new Panther and Tiger tanks to arrive. The delay allowed Soviet defenses to become nearly impenetrable. When the attack finally began in July 1943, German forces encountered relentless resistance. The massive tank clash at Prokhorovka became one of the largest armored battles in history. Despite tactical skill, German forces could not achieve a decisive breakthrough. Losses in experienced crews and equipment were irreplaceable. At the same time, the Western Allies had landed in Sicily. Facing pressure on multiple fronts, Hitler called off Operation Citadel. Kursk marked the last major German offensive in the east. From that moment forward, strategic initiative belonged permanently to the Red Army. Another devastating long-term mistake was Germany's failure to prioritize technological innovation effectively. While Germany developed advanced weapons, including the V-1 and V-2 rockets, many were introduced too late or diverted resources from more practical systems. The obsession with wonder weapons consumed industrial capacity that could have produced larger quantities of reliable aircraft and tanks earlier in the war. Jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me-262 had enormous potential, but Hitler insisted on modifying it into a bomber rather than focusing on its fighter role, delaying its effective deployment. Again, ideology and personal interference distorted military logic.
Meanwhile, Allied strategic bombing campaigns intensified. German industry, though resilient, faced growing strain. Synthetic fuel plants became primary targets. Without fuel, tanks and aircraft were useless. And then there was the Atlantic. Germany's U-boat campaign had initially threatened to strangle Britain's supply lines, but the failure to invest earlier in large-scale submarine production, combined with Allied advances in radar, sonar, and code breaking, shifted the balance. By mid-1943, U-boat losses became unsustainable. Germany had lost control of the Atlantic. Each theater revealed the same pattern: early success, overextension, delayed adaptation, and leadership interference. But perhaps the most significant strategic failure was psychological. By 1944, many German commanders understood the war was unwinnable. Yet Hitler's authority prevented flexible withdrawals or negotiated options. Entire formations were ordered to stand fast in impossible conditions. Strategic defense became rigid defense. And rigidity in modern warfare is fatal. As the Red Army advanced westward and Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France, Germany faced the reality of a two-front land war.
precisely the nightmare scenario it had historically feared. The final collapse would not come from a single battle. It would come from accumulated miscalculations. By 1944, the strategic map of Europe had turned against Germany. In the east, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly. In the south, Italy had become a grinding defensive front after the Allied landings in 1943. German industry was under constant bombardment. Fuel shortages were worsening. Experienced pilots and tank crews were irreplaceable. And yet, in the West, Hitler remained convinced that the decisive Allied invasion would not come where his generals feared most. The Atlantic Wall stretched from Norway to the Spanish border, an immense defensive system of bunkers, artillery positions, mines, and obstacles. But despite its size, it was incomplete, uneven, and dependent on rapid armored reinforcement. The question was simple: where would the Allies land? Field Marshal Erwin Rommel believed the invasion must be crushed on the beaches. Once Allied forces established a foothold, their naval artillery and air superiority would make counterattack nearly impossible. He pushed for panzer divisions to be positioned close to the coast. Others, including Gerd von Rundstedt, argued for holding armored reserves inland, allowing flexibility to respond once the main landing point was identified. Hitler split the difference, and in doing so, he created paralysis. The panzer divisions were divided. Some were placed under direct control of OKW, the OKW High Command, others under regional commanders. Crucially, several armored divisions could only be released with Hitler's personal authorization. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord. At dawn, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. American troops landed at Omaha and Utah. British and Canadian forces struck Gold, Juno, and Sword. Paratroopers had dropped inland during the night to disrupt communications and seize key bridges. German radar and reconnaissance had detected unusual activity, but months of Allied deception operations had sown confusion. The elaborate Operation Fortitude convinced German intelligence that the main invasion would occur at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Even after the landings began, many German commanders believed it was a diversion. Hitler was asleep when the invasion reports reached headquarters. His staff hesitated to wake him. Hours passed before armored reserves were authorized to move. Those hours were decisive. Allied naval bombardment was overwhelming. Air superiority was total. German reinforcements moving toward the beaches were harassed and destroyed by Allied fighter bombers. Bridges were targeted, columns were strafed. Movement by daylight became nearly impossible. Rommel's worst fear materialized. Once the Allies secured the beaches, pushing them back into the sea became nearly unattainable. Omaha Beach saw brutal fighting. German defenses inflicted heavy casualties, but Allied forces adapted, climbed the bluffs, and gradually broke through. Within days, a permanent Western front had been established. This was not simply a tactical defeat, it was a strategic unraveling. Germany now faced full-scale land offensives from both east and west simultaneously. The nightmare of a two-front war had fully matured. The failure to concentrate armored power near Normandy was compounded by Hitler's refusal to allow flexible withdrawal. As Allied forces expanded their foothold, German commanders requested tactical retreats to shorten defensive lines. Again, the answer was no. Stand fast. The same order that had doomed Stalingrad now shaped the Western Front. In August 1944, Allied forces encircled large elements of the German army in the Falaise Pocket. Thousands of German troops were killed or captured. Large quantities of equipment were abandoned. Though some escaped, the Western defensive line in France effectively collapsed. Paris was liberated later that month. Meanwhile, in the east, an even greater catastrophe unfolded. In June 1944, the same month as D-Day, the Red Army launched Operation Barbarossa against German Army Group Center in Belarus. It was one of the most devastating offensives of the war. German intelligence had misjudged Soviet strength yet again. Defensive preparations were inadequate. Hitler refused preemptive withdrawals to stronger positions. The result was annihilation. Army Group Center was shattered. Entire corps ceased to exist. By the end of the operation, Germany had lost approximately 300,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. It was arguably more catastrophic than Stalingrad. The pattern remained consistent: underestimate the enemy, overestimate defensive resilience, forbid maneuver, absorb destruction. And still, Hitler believed one decisive blow could reverse everything. That belief led to the Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, Hitler launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, the same region used successfully in 1940. The objective was ambitious: split British and American forces, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The plan relied on speed, secrecy, and poor winter weather grounding Allied aircraft. Initially, the offensive achieved surprise. German forces penetrated Allied lines, creating a bulge in the front. American units were caught off guard. Towns like Bastogne became focal points of intense fighting. But the strategic reality was stark. Germany no longer possessed the fuel reserves, manpower, or air superiority of 1940. Many attacking units were under strength. Fuel shortages were so severe that German armored units depended on capturing Allied fuel depots to continue advancing. When weather conditions cleared, Allied air power returned with devastating effect. German columns were bombed relentlessly. Supply lines crumbled. The offensive stalled. The siege of Bastogne became symbolic. Surrounded American forces refused to surrender. German momentum dissipated. Within weeks, the bulge was erased. The Ardennes offensive consumed Germany's last strategic reserves. After that, there would be no more large-scale offensives in the West. Another crippling strategic mistake throughout the war had been the mismanagement of resources. German production increased significantly under Albert Speer after 1942, but systemic inefficiencies remained. Rivalries between branches of the armed forces led to duplication and waste. The Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, and Heer competed for resources rather than coordinating effectively. Hitler's leadership style encouraged competition instead of unity. Overlapping authorities created confusion. Furthermore, Germany failed to fully mobilize its economy early enough. Women were not integrated into industrial labor at the scale seen in Britain or the Soviet Union until much later. Ideological constraints limited practical solutions. The Allied powers, meanwhile, streamlined production. The United States became the arsenal of democracy, producing staggering numbers of ships, aircraft, tanks, and trucks. Germany simply could not match that output. By early 1945, Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. Soviet troops were advancing towards Berlin. German cities lay in ruins under relentless bombing. And yet, Hitler continued issuing orders for counterattacks by formations that were under strength, undersupplied, or non-existent. Divisions destroyed on the Eastern Front were still referenced on situation maps. Teenagers and elderly men were mobilized into the Volkssturm, a last-ditch militia with minimal training and insufficient weapons. It was no longer strategy, it was delusion. As Soviet forces closed in, the Battle of Berlin began in April 1945. The Red Army encircled the city with overwhelming artillery and manpower. Street fighting echoed the horrors of Stalingrad, but this time Germany was on the defensive and there would be no relief. German commanders requested permission to break out. Once again, the answer was no. Berlin will be defended to the last man. The result was catastrophic civilian suffering. Infrastructure collapsed, food supplies vanished,
artillery bombardment reduced entire districts to rubble. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. The regime he had built through aggression, ideology, and calculated intimidation ended not in triumph, but in ruins.
On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. But the end of the war also marked the final consequence of accumulated strategic failures that had unfolded over 6 brutal years. When we step back and examine the full scope of Germany's strategic mistakes during World War II, patterns become unmistakable. The first was overconfidence born from early victories. The rapid defeats of Poland and France created the illusion that speed alone could overcome industrial reality. The second was ideological interference. Strategic decisions were repeatedly shaped by racial doctrine, personal pride, and symbolic obsession rather than military pragmatism. The third was the catastrophic underestimation of enemies, particularly the Soviet Union and the United States. Germany failed to grasp the scale of industrial mobilization it would face once those powers were fully engaged. The fourth was logistical negligence. From the vast distances of the Eastern Front to fuel shortages in the Ardennes, German operations consistently outran their supply capacity. The fifth was inflexibility. Again and again, at Stalingrad, in Normandy, in Belarus, in Berlin, commanders were denied the ability to maneuver, withdraw, or adapt. War punishes rigidity. Another critical failure lay in alliance management. Dependence on weaker Axis partners to hold critical sectors exposed structural vulnerabilities. When those lines collapsed, German forces were left encircled and overwhelmed. Technological misallocation also played a role. Advanced weapons like the V-2 rocket were engineering achievements, but strategically insignificant compared to the massive Allied production of reliable aircraft, ships, and armored vehicles. Resources were invested in prestige projects instead of scalable solutions. And then there was the decision that may have sealed Germany's fate more than any other: declaring war on the United States after the attack on Pearl Harbor. That declaration transformed a continental war into an industrial contest Germany could not win. American shipyards, factories, and oil reserves shifted the balance permanently. Once U.S. forces were fully mobilized, the strategic equation became brutally simple. Germany was outproduced, outmanned, outflanked. By 1943, the initiative had shifted irreversibly to the Allies. From that point forward, Germany fought not for victory, but for delay. And delay is not a strategy. It is a countdown. World War II would ultimately claim over 70 million lives. Cities were leveled, borders were redrawn, the global balance of power shifted permanently. The war gave rise to the Cold War, divided Europe, and ushered in the nuclear age. But behind the massive numbers and global consequences lies a sobering truth. Wars are not only lost on battlefields, they are lost in conference rooms, in misjudged assumptions, in ignored intelligence reports, in leaders who refuse to adapt. Germany's defeat was not inevitable in 1939, but through a series of compounding strategic mistakes, political, military, economic, and ideological, the path to collapse became unavoidable. From the failure to defeat Britain, to the disaster at Stalingrad, from the miscalculation at Kursk, to the inability to repel the invasion of Normandy, from the shattered gamble in the Ardennes, to the final stand in Berlin, each decision narrowed the options. Each refusal to adapt accelerated the end. History often remembers battles, but strategy decides wars. If you stayed until this moment, comment the word strategy below so we know you made it to the end. What do you think was Germany's biggest strategic mistake? Was it invading the Soviet Union, declaring war on the United States, or refusing to retreat at critical moments? Leave your opinion in the comments. We read every single one. If you found this documentary valuable, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more deep war analysis based on real historical accounts. And keep watching. The next videos appearing on your screen will take you even deeper into the decisions that shaped World War II and the modern world. History is not just about what happened, it's about understanding why it happened.